are in a second segment of the talk with Dr. Matthew McVarish. In the first segment, we've heard about his experiences as the childhood abuse survivor, and also a little bit about your Road to Change project, but we'll talk in more detail about it. But picking up pieces from where we left in the last segment based on your journey as a survivor. So I think one of the most important aspects here is, as I said earlier, that about sexual abuse of boys. You mentioned that you were 7 siblings and 4 brothers were sexually abused. And usually there is this big myth about only girls being abused and parents kind of protecting more girls than boys, but boys are equally vulnerable. So do you want to share a little bit more about what you think about it, considering that your 4 brothers, including yourself, and 3 brothers were sexually abused by your godfather?
I think, yeah, certainly there's a discrepancy with how it's perceived, sadly. The idea that girls are more vulnerable is untrue, because boys are young boys, children are always equally vulnerable. I mean, I think there's an organization in New York who specifically help male survivors. And from their research, I believe 1 in 4 of the men who have been abused in childhood were abused by a woman. And that could be a sister or a grandmother. And I think, again, that seems even more incomprehensible. A lot of people just don't think that's possible. They assume that the offender is a man and the victim is a young girl. You know, I was at a conference, and there was an organization there from Indonesia, and they put together a DVD, and the DVD was called "It Happens to Boys Too." And this was like, for them, they were really trying to push this concept, you know, because people just didn't think it was true, you know, which is incredible. I think it's sad that what I noticed in all the countries that I've worked in is that there's a different degree to which the country has become accepting of things like homosexuality. And so the more conservative a country is, you know, the more that they promote fear of homosexuality, then the more that boys who've been abused by a man are unlikely to report that this has happened, because there's this strange stigma and kind of confused assumption that if you're sexually abused by a man, and somehow that would make you gay, you know, which is complete nonsense. But I think what I have seen is in many countries, and it's lots of different places around the world, and even within the UK, there's pockets of the UK where, you know, there is real conservatism and bigotry. And in these places, young people are still suffering from an enforced silence because they feel that they can't talk about what's happened to them, because they believe that will make them associated with some sort of homosexuality, which in their environment might be the worst thing that can possibly be associated with, sadly. So I've said, I think I was talking to a journalist in Romania, and I said, you know, homophobia really breeds pedophilia. And he said, yes, I know. And I was like, no, I don't think you understood what I just said. I didn't say homosexuality breeds pedophilia. It's the opposite. Yeah. The opposite is true. If you create a fear of the LGBTQAI plus community, you're creating an environment that incubates the silence of young victims, which is so unjust for everyone, and really dangerous.
True. And I think also, of course, what you said about homophobia is so true. And there are issues, I think, around masculinity as well there, like the clients that I have seen. I've worked with children who've been sexually abused, including boys and girls, as well as adult survivors who've been men or boys. And somewhere the whole notion of being the protector and the provider also kind of stops them from coming forward and sharing their experience or reporting about their experiences, because there is this sense that I, as a man, is supposed to be protecting women, especially in our culture back in India and South Asia. They are supposed to be stronger, they are supposed to be provider, which kind of, again, when they get abused, it makes them feel weak and feeling like a victim, and therefore just being quiet about it. So I guess all those issues as well kind of...
Also, the masculinity, I think, call it toxic masculinity, and the idea that men are not supposed to show emotion. They're supposed to be very, very contained and very calm.
Sure.
One of the most common residual outcomes of having been violated in childhood is this kind of anger that you're left with, and sadness. And what we've seen, there was do you know the ACE study, which was done in the late 90s, the Adverse Childhood Experience Study.
Yeah.
And this linked various negative outcomes in adult life from having been abused in your childhood. And one of them for men is an increase in domestic violence, because you have these men who on the inside feel violated, and they feel, they feel like the worst thing they can let themselves be is vulnerable. They feel insecure, and overall they feel this rage, but they're not ever afforded the opportunity to explore this or express this in a safe and calm therapeutic environment.
Right.
Men in many cultures are not allowed to go to therapy. They're not allowed to show emotion or even show that there's anything they'd have to talk about emotionally. So all of that gets suppressed, but as you know, you can't suppress that kind of thing. Eventually it erupts, and that eruption gets directed at the nearest person to them, which might be their partner or their wife. So what you see in many cultures is this prevalent violence that's perpetrated by men, maybe not in a sexual way, but certainly in a physical way, to their partners, and that stems from a childhood violation that they suffered. And this cycle of abuse really, really needs to be interrupted.
Yeah. And as again you say in your book, like if you've been hurt, it doesn't mean that you can hurt others, whether it's other children, other animals, or other human beings, men, women. So it is about actually looking at a safe way to express or vent out your suppressed emotions and feelings, so that you can handle that and deal with that, or understand that, give it the right meaning and association, and deal with that in a more positive way rather than in a more...
Everyone needs to take responsibility for their own healing, but it's very new, this concept of psychological analysis, and I think it literally in the past couple of decades we're really allowing men certainly to find a therapist. And I remember I was in one country, I was in Latvia, and they had an organization who helped women and children who'd been sexually assaulted. And I said, well, where did the men go? And I think at that point they'd been in operation for 6 years. And they said, well, yeah, a man once called here. And I was thinking, 1 in 6 men in this country was violated in childhood. And in 6 years, you've had one phone call from one person.
Yeah.
So I think it's partly that men are reluctant to come forward, but it's also partly that in their societies, there isn't as many services provided for men to go to. And I realize that resources are always tight. They're always, I've never met an organization who had enough money to do all the things they wanted to do or needed to do. But certainly what happens is that they try to help the majority of people, and the majority of victims are sadly women. So the majority of help tends to go towards helping the majority of victims. But it does leave a discrepancy. And one day, hopefully, we can start to redress the balance. And as more male survivors are supported, we would hopefully start to see the whole thing flatlining.
Yeah, no, you said it right in terms of sometimes there is no legal recourse as well. I remember when I started working on childhood sexual abuse, which was way back in '96, I started in India, and then of course came here to do my PhD looking at more in-depth therapeutic interventions for children with sexual abuse experiences. But I think one of our struggles in India initially was that there was really no law under which you could report sexual abuse of boys, because at that point, the legislation was framed in a way that there was only rape and outraging the modesty of women. So which meant only women could go and complain, and anything to do with sexual abuse, which went under a section which was a big problematic section earlier, section 377, which talked about unnatural offenses, which really covered a bit of homosexuality and things like that, which is decriminalized now, which is a big good progress in India. But also in 2012, then in India, there was a new act which came, protection of children from sexual abuse offenses, POCSO it's called, which then took account of anyone, boys or girls abused, and they could go and complain, which was again a big progress in the country. So yes, you rightly said, sometimes the resources, the legislations and policies are also such that stop certain people from going forward and complaining about their abuse. But I think we've raised a good big point here that yes, both girls and boys are abused. Research does show that there are more girls being abused than boys, but again, there is an element of whether boys are coming forward and complaining or not. And I think the important aspect you also raised is that there are we feel offenders are mostly men, which again, research shows that offenders, specifically when the childhood sexual abuse, in case of childhood sexual abuse, offenders are usually people who children trust, or from within the family, or someone who's known to the child. And it could be, in research, it shows more men, but there could be women offenders as well. So these are points which I think we need to demystify somewhere and take note of. So thank you for raising those points. Going back to the impact of childhood sexual abuse, the whole silence and shame that you talked about. So I think, again, it would be good to talk a little more about it, that why is it so difficult for a child to come forward and talk about it? And why are they living in silence? And how the offenders are actually preying on this silence and vulnerability of children to abuse them, and how it takes years for a child to break that silence and come out of it. Sometimes 40 years, 20 years, 30 years after the abuse had happened as an adult survivor. So in your own experience, yourself and your brothers, again, no one talked about it at all. So what do you think, and how does that impact the child who's being abused? And how do you then break that silence?
I think, yeah, for me and my brothers, we were growing up in the west of Scotland in the 90s was a hugely homophobic environment. And especially with that Catholic household, we wouldn't talk about anything sexual or anything relating to sex. Would not be a conversation that could just be brought up easily. I think after I walked around Europe and I'd met survivors in various countries, and after that I started working globally, and I met a lot of survivors in different parts of Asia and the United States. And so the Scottish government asked me to write a paper to share everything that I'd observed, everything that I now knew. And I created a paper called The Quality of Silence. And this was basically, I wrote down everything that I'd observed, which was that there is nowhere in the world, there's no place in the world where talking about the sexual abuse of children is a comfortable topic. So that's unanimous, that's universal. But the reasons that people don't talk about abuse are different. And the way I tried to explain it, I was saying that if you crack your tooth or if you break your wrist, you'll feel pain, but you'll feel a different kind of pain. And in order to fix these things, you have to do very different kind of treatment. And essentially, there's different kinds of shame. So if you've got, I think in my TED talk, I talk about if you've got a 12-year-old Muslim girl from a very wealthy family in Glasgow, if she's been sexually violated, the chances of her disclosing would be different from an 8-year-old Catholic boy in a very poor part of Edinburgh. And these two children live in the same country, but they actually occupy very different worlds. And there's different qualities about their immediate environment that makes the disclosure very difficult. I think in your documentary that I saw, you talk about very often in certain communities, the translator is an elder of the community who comes with them to the police, and so even then, for reasons of embarrassment and conservatism, as they're translating what's being said to the police for police records, they're editing it to try and soften the blow of the crime itself. I mean, that's one example. I think, and for other examples of why you can't talk about it in Greece and Cyprus, there's there's a kind of culture that the oldest member of the family is the head of the family, and that their word is infallible. So you therefore can't say anything negative or accusatory about someone who's older than you. So how can a child in that environment disclose abuse? You know, if the world that they live in means that you can't do that. If you got somewhere like Luxembourg, the entire country is about 500,000 people. That's like the population of Glasgow. So if you're in an environment like that, where pretty much everyone knows everyone to a certain extent, the community is very small, how can you then bring legal action against someone? Because in that, you know, that like a microwave, everyone's very, very close to everyone, and it gets very, very intense. But there can be other things, like when I was in Belfast in Northern Ireland, you see, you got an environment there which is unique. So the Irish the Northern Irish Catholics and the Northern Irish Protestants have been fighting for a very, very long time. And they hate each other, but the majority of people who are sexually abused by someone within their own community.
Yeah.
Therefore, the Catholics are abused by the Catholics, and the Protestant kids are abused by Protestants. But if you live in an environment where your community is at war with another community, you cannot say anything negative about your own community. You can't blow the whistle. You can't be the one to show that there's anything wrong about your side. Yeah. So that makes it really difficult for people in that particular situation. So what I talk about in the quality of silence is these kind of unique environmental qualities for the survivor. And I think if you're someone who's been abused and you've never discussed it, consider, what is it about the place where you grew up and the family situation you were in that makes you think you can't talk about it? Because when you start to identify them as just cultural factors, you can start to find ways to overcome them, I think.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting you bring up all these, like, of course, the environmental, social, political, all the factors that you're talking about. And you mentioned our documentary, Hidden in Silence, within the Scottish ethnic minorities, that we made a few years ago and worked with Scottish government to make a training tool of that. We raised some of these issues. And I think in addition to what you've shared, we also came across two other aspects, specifically in the South Asian communities, where marriageability of girls is a big issue. So if you know that the girl is sexually abused, then she won't get married, or there would be issues around that. And even I think one of the things that we talked about, agency of children per se. So mostly adults are more believed, or they have more trust and faith of people rather than children. So when children say something, it's usually shrugged or disbelieved or considered as their fantasy or things like that, rather than actually making the offender take the responsibility for it. So of course, yeah, there are a lot of complex issues, and of course offenders know, the pedophiles know about it, and they know how to manipulate a child to take advantage of these factors. But the interesting aspect also is that not only that children stay silent in the situation when they are getting abused, but even when they share, like in your case and in case of a lot of clients that I work with, even families, once they know, they choose to stay quiet about it rather than reporting it. Again, even in your case, for many years, as you mentioned earlier, once your family came to know, the good thing was that Terry wasn't allowed in the family. But to actually go out and file a police case took much longer, because somewhere there were, again, these factors that you don't want others to know about it.
I think that's it. I mean, the one thing that we need to realize is that it's massively sad. The whole situation is overwhelmingly sad. And, I had one lady, I think, who was a survivor in Central Europe, and she'd asked me, I try to talk about this and my family don't want to talk to me about it.
Yeah, yeah.
And she says, what can I do? And I said, perhaps you can remember that, you're asking your parents to talk about something that happened to you or that was done to you when you were a child. At that time, they were responsible for your safety, and they failed really badly. They let you down, and their mistake and their oversight cost you dearly. So in one level, maybe not even consciously, when you try to talk about it with your family or your friends, they might be feeling that they've failed you. And the more you talk about it, the more sadness and shame they might feel, because in a way, my parents let it happen. They didn't consciously let it happen, but you know, they were the only ones responsible for me as a child, and this was done to me. Sometimes, you know, whilst they were quite close and they didn't see it happening. And so, although I don't hold them responsible, they might feel my mother passed away, but my father, you know, he might feel that, you know, he let me down. And the thing is, like, for me, like, I've completely forgiven my parents for that. And that, when I started therapy when I was 17, the first thing that came up was anger at my parents for not protecting me. Of course, they didn't actually know it was happening, but they should have known. It was their responsibility. And so I had this anger, and I had to decide, you know, am I going to spend the rest of my life angry at my parents for their mistake? Or am I going to forgive them because this wasn't their doing? They didn't do this to me.
Yeah.
And the thing is, if I did spend the rest of my life angry at them, my uncle and his abuse would also have cost me my relationship with my parents. And I decided not to let my uncle's abuse take anything else away from the rest of my life. And that's why I immediately forgave everyone else involved, so that I could start to move forward.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess the thing that I mentioned earlier about agency of the child. So you trust the adults, trust other adults so much. Like in your case, your offender was the godfather. So they never, and your mother's brother. So she could have never thought he could do something. That blind faith in other adults. And same thing happens in so many communities where children are, like, especially again in South Asian communities that we saw when we were making the documentary, children are sleeping with their uncles, even girls or boys, and they never think that an uncle can actually abuse, or the father could actually abuse the child. So that blind faith kind of, you know, because of that, parents kind of turn their eyes to something like this. And even when the child talks about it, it's like completely disbelief that this cannot happen. This man cannot do this to this child, you know. So I guess there are all these, again, complex issues which parents don't realize. But I've also seen sometimes parents, which I think is much more devastating, where the child shares with the parents and they don't believe the child and keep letting the offender come around and visit the family, or see them in family functions and things like that. So that is actually much more devastating, where parents don't even take any action afterwards when a child has actually shared with them about the abuse. So
I think, yeah, and that's, I mean, hopefully in humanity that's beginning to happen less, you know, for like what you're doing today. These kind of information sharing is really starting to spread around the world. It is going to take a very long time, you know. And I think one of the things that I said, I think you were there that night at the Scottish Parliament when I finally got home after
yes,
the walk, and I said, you know, that what I've learned about sexual abuse, like there was nothing fortunate about being sexually abused in my childhood, but having been to all these other countries, I realized that I was fortunate that I was sexually abused in Scotland, because we have a police force who, I think that, Malcolm Graham, who was the ACC of the Scottish Police Scotland, and he'd said, we want survivors to know that if you report child sexual abuse, you will be believed.
yeah, yeah.
That is the opposite of what the head of other police forces had said. Literally, I'd heard them say it to me. So we were fortunate, my brothers and I were fortunate that we lived in a country that had the Moira Anderson Foundation. I mean, these kind of organizations and the help that they provide is quite sophisticated. And I get emails from people in parts of the world where the help that they need doesn't exist yet, you know.
Yeah. No, you said we interviewed Malcolm Graham for a documentary as well, and he says it very categorically that no matter what time, what age, when you got abused, no matter which community, where you are from, we are there to help you, which I think is a very big statement for survivors to kind of hear and maybe come forward. Yeah.
I think there's something about, as a child, when you're a child and a teenager, sex and the whole world of sex is very kind of new and quite overwhelming, I think. And so when you have to disclose that someone touched you in a sexual way, in order for someone to understand what you're saying, they're going to have to get a mental picture of what you've said. And I think children and adults even, you don't want to give someone a mental image of you and being violated in such a vulnerable way. And so that simple thing alone of having to give someone these mental images in order for them to understand what it is you're saying is so hard. You know, I think you kind of need to get to the point of, well, this still wasn't my shame. This was their shame, you know.
Yeah. I think that brings to the next point of shame associated with the whole sex or sexualities, issues around sexuality. And I guess that's where the need to actually, you know, we hear a lot about stranger danger and awareness, kind of, you know, how you have to protect yourself from strangers. There's this whole, which has been there for decades now, but there is less awareness. There's more now as compared to past, but again, more awareness needs to be created among children that you could be abused by someone who's known, and there is nothing to feel shame about. So I think the shame and sexuality somewhere needs to be disconnected, as you said, that mental image and that. What do you think about that? Once we know that we can talk about sexuality openly and there's no shame with that, maybe children will feel more empowered to talk about it. Like so many times I've seen children don't even know names of the body parts. So good touch, bad touch, things like that, which again affects them in being able to talk about it.
I think there's, and again, it's very, very ingrained in the different cultures. You know, I think in Scandinavia, you see there's a really, what I admired as a British person was that the idea of nudity was about well-being and health. It wasn't about sexuality. Like in Finland, they have, I think, 2 million saunas in Helsinki. And it's very common for the entire family of all ages to be naked. And that situation is not in any way sexual, you know, whereas in Britain, that would be completely inconceivable that would happen, that you'd have people of different age groups in the same place with no clothes on. Whereas in Scandinavia, they also have, I remember watching a documentary, I think it was in Denmark, and they were asking a 5-year-old, you know, about what is gay. And she said, oh, that's when a man marries a man. Now, the thing is, this child knew what gay was. They didn't have any concept of gay sex, but they understood in the same way that a 5-year-old girl understands the story of Cinderella, that Cinderella falls in love with the prince. That 5-year-old doesn't know what happens on the honeymoon, but she understands love. And the 5-year-old can understand the different forms of loving relationships. And that's separate from sexuality and anything else. So I think the more that we can promote a healthy discussion around the different forms of gender and relationships, we can create an environment where hopefully there's nothing that we can't talk about, you know. Sure. But I'm not suggesting that we have sex education any younger for young children. Absolutely not. But I do think there's no harm in a 5-year-old understanding that a man can marry a man, and you know, and the other forms of relationships.
Yeah. I guess there's so many different interconnected aspects here which we can go on talking about, but I just see that time is, I think we've had this segment longer than I would have expected it to be, but I think there were issues that were being discussed, so I didn't want to stop. So I think I will end this segment here, again, for people to kind of take a deep breath, reflect over what we've talked about. So breathe in, breathe out, and come back to the third segment where I would like to again explore a little more issues around, again, you've talked about homosexuality, and a lot of people think that because you've been sexually abused, you're a gay, which we talked about actually in my first interview with a friend who talked about experiences as a lesbian. So I want to again explore a little more about that and talk a little more about the legal aspects of your case, and then of course your own journey, Road to Change project, your book, your work with the Global Survivor Forum. So I think there's so much more about your life, your transition from survivor to being an activist and now going out and doing work around these issues. So we'll talk more about that in the next segment. So I'll end this here and see you in the third segment of our talk.